All right, so welcome to our lecture on how geographical situation can affect development. We're going to look at a couple of different theories to talk about geographical situation. Remember that situation, when we're talking about site and situation, is a form of relative location. So what we're looking at really is how one area of the world is connected to other areas of the world or linked to other areas of the world as a way of talking about what their level of development is, or how that level of development might be influenced or changed. So, some things to know. First of all is that development always happens in context. Okay, so it depends on what's going on at multiple scales. It depends on what's happening at various places. And it's a result really of forces that operate concurrently, which is a fancy way of saying at the same time, at different scales. There's global forces, there's local forces, and things like that that we're going to be looking at, talking about a little bit, and that we'll be continuing to talk about as we talk about this unit and go through really the rest of the year. So one of the major ideas that you need to remember is this idea of neocolonialism. Okay, and neocolonialism is really, that prefix neo just means new, so it's a new form of colonialism. And the way the theory goes is that the major world powers continue to control the economies of poorer countries, even though the poorer countries are now politically independent. And really what that means, or what that translates to, is that those poorer countries, those former colonies, still do the vast majority of their exporting and the vast majority of their business with their former colonizing power. Okay, and so in that way, the former colonizing power can continue to exert significant control over what's going on within that poorer country by choosing, for instance, to place certain expectations on products coming into the country, or to fail to basically decide that they're not going to import from that country, or things like that. All kinds of things that they could do to influence what's going on in poorer countries and in the economies of poorer countries. Okay, and with that, neocolonialism. Okay, so that's one of those ideas, and I want you to keep it in mind as we go through, because we're going to talk about some theories that apply that idea. We're also going to talk about what's called structuralist theory. Okay, and this is really structuralist. It's talking about the structure of the world economy. Okay. And the basic gist of the theory is that there are very difficult to change large-scale economic arrangements that shape what happens in various countries in very fundamental ways. And these large-scale economic arrangements, I want you to think like major treaties, I want you to think neocolonialism, all those kind of really big global-scale economic arrangements that can make a huge difference in terms of what happens from one day to another. Okay, so going back to neocolonialism, talk a little bit about dependency theory. Okay, and dependency theory is the basic idea that political and economic relationships between countries and really regions of the world control and limit the possibility for economic development in poorer areas. Okay, so what that means is that those poorer areas depend on more developed areas. And the ways in which they limit the economic development might be, for instance, by wealthier countries engaging in certain types of economic activities, or so, for instance, with Africa, there's a huge export-based economy for much of Africa, not all of Africa, but a lot of Africa. And so, if, for instance, we're talking about gold, and a lot of today's gold comes out of certain areas of Africa, and I'm drawing a blank on specific countries, so I apologize for that. But the fact that that's what's in demand means that that's what countries are going to try and develop as they try to get more money into their economy in order to be able to raise the overall level of development. Right, and this has a huge, huge impact. So, for example, we could talk about Brazil and their export economy, and the fact that now that they no longer are exporting as much in the way of resources, it's really hit their government in terms of the budget, and in terms of what they're able to do with the money that they do have. Okay, so for instance, if we were talking about another way that those economic relationships are shaped, by the way, is the choice of a country to adapt the currency of another country in order to, for the purposes of economics, right? So a really popular thing to do is what's called dollarization, which is to say that we take a country's currency, for instance, the colon from Venezuela, or from Colombia, sorry, I think the colon's from Colombia, but at any rate, and say, we're just not going to use that anymore, and we're going to make everybody trade those in, and we're going to trade them in for a set rate of dollars, and now we're just going to use US dollars for all of our buying and selling and things like that. Okay? And what this does with those poorer countries, and this is part of the big debate right now with what's going on with the global economy, is those poorer countries are now reliant on U.S. monetary policy in terms of how many dollars are available, in terms of how much they can import and export, right, and things like that. And so one of the major concerns with the U.S. government right now is they're talking about raising the benchmark interest rate, which is the rate at which banks can loan each other money. The big piece you need to know about that is if that interest rate goes up, then interest rates for consumers in general go up, and the demand for dollars then goes down. And so the idea is to decrease demand for dollars. Well, if there's less demand for dollars, then the U.S. government is printing fewer dollars. Fewer dollars in service, and each one becomes still more valuable. And it's something like 2/3 of hard currency that the U.S. prints is actually used outside of the United States. So I don't remember the exact figure, so don't quote me on that, 2/3. But it is a huge amount like that. And so that's something to keep in mind when you're looking at how countries develop economically, is even if they do have an internal currency, they may be basically required or expected to denominate their exports in the currency of the country they're exporting to, which oftentimes is the United States, not always. But the US dollar is, for example, an easy way to denominate exports because it's got a generally agreed upon value. And so a lot of businesses do their business in dollars, just like a lot of business people do their business when they talk in English, even if they're talking even if it's international business people, because it's kind of the language of business. Come back to that idea of language of business a little bit later when we get to culture and talk about language. Just know that that idea is out there, and that's one of those things to worry about. So another big theory, and we've talked about this a lot in class, and we've hit it on it in almost every unit now. Okay, and we haven't really called it this, but you need to know this. Is Wallerstein's world systems theory. You need to recognize world systems theory. You need to know the name. You need to recognize that it was created by a guy named Wallerstein. Okay, and basically what you need to know is it's got a 3-tier structure. The original structure was 2-tier, but it's been expanded to include a third tier. And we've got the global core. Okay, and these are our wealthy countries. And these are countries that are more developed. Then we've got the global periphery, and these are our poor countries, and they're underdeveloped. Okay, so they're developing. And then we've got the semi-periphery, which shows some of the traits of the core. They're better developed. Economically, they're better developed in terms of government and things like that. But they're not as well developed as the core, and they're still getting taken advantage of in some ways by the core. Okay? But the whole goal of this 3-tier structure, and this is one of those structuralist theories, is that to explain interconnections between places when we're talking about the global economy. Okay? When core processes, and by core processes what we mean are that high-level manufacturing, we talk about a service-based economy, and things like that. Wealth is generated for the people of that place. That's why core countries are wealthy, is because they have those core processes. They've developed to the point where those core processes are in place, right? Education levels are high, technology use is more widespread, things like that. Peripheral processes, on the other hand, are those that require little education, low technologies, and they don't generate a lot of wealth, a lot of wages, or a lot of other benefits. Okay, and these, again, we talk about are related to those primary economic activities, right? It doesn't take a whole lot of education to be a miner. Now, if you want to be a mining engineer and figure out where the hole in the ground is going to go, that's a separate story, right? But to actually be the man who goes down and digs the coal out of the ground, that doesn't require a ton of education. Okay? It requires a lot of practical knowledge, but not a lot of book knowledge necessarily. Our semi-periphery countries, on the other hand, exhibit both core and periphery processes again, okay? And they kind of act as a buffer between the core and the periphery in the world economy. So they give the periphery hope that they'll rise up, and they give the core a market for those services and things like that the core countries are increasingly seeking to export and to internationalize. So last slide here. World systems theory, the whole goal is to make explicit the power relations amongst places, and doesn't assume, unlike Rostow, right? Rostow assumes that everybody goes through the same phases in the same order. This doesn't assume people are going to follow the same steps. Okay, it doesn't assume that people are going to develop in the same order, or even that people are going to develop at all. It's just saying, here's what it is. Okay, these people are powerful, these people are not powerful, these people kind of have a little power, and here's some of why. Okay, world systems theory sees really exploitation as a function of the capitalist drive for profit in the global economy. Okay, and exploitation both in terms of resources, in terms of we're going to pay you a lot less than we would pay people over here because there's more of you and you're not going to do the work quite as well, so we're not going to pay you as much. But that's okay because, you know, we get cheap stuff. That's really what we're talking about, right? Exploitation, taking advantage of people. Okay, and the nice part about world systems theory is that we can look at it at scales beyond the state. Okay, so we can look at periphery processes in core countries, for example. So we could look at some of the poorest areas in the United States and we could say, wow, they really have periphery processes. Those are really areas where there's not a lot of higher level education, where people are engaged mostly in primary economic activities, so there's lots of unemployment, right, and things like that, versus areas where there's core processes in periphery countries, right? So if we look at, for instance, what's a good example of a periphery country? South Africa is increasingly dropping down into the periphery, but if we looked at the capital of South Africa, what we would see is a lot of core processes, right? There's a pretty fair amount of economic development, higher levels of education in the capital, and things like that. South Africa is not yet in the periphery, but interestingly enough, as their credit rating goes down, as the government becomes less and less effective under Jacob Zuma, I would argue I think they're trending that direction. Sorry there. So this has been our lecture about how geographic situation affects development. Major ideas to remember: one is you got to know core periphery model, and you got to know that it's a structuralist theory, so it looks at the structure of the economy. You need to understand neocolonialism, okay, and the role that that can play in the economy and in dependency theory. Okay, and then just understand that really where you're at matters, and the history of the place where you're at matters. And that makes a huge impact, and that's one of the arguments of neocolonialism, is that the history of the country matters. And we can't just look at these places and say, oh, well, you suck because you suck, right? But instead we got to look at the history of the place and say, oh, well, you suck because you haven't been given the same opportunities as other places. So if you have questions, please feel free to come in and come see me, and I'd be delighted to answer any questions you have and help you out any way I can. And I guess I will see you the next time class meets.